Thank you so much. So, yes, I'm very excited to chat with everyone today and explore the topic that we have supporting self-care and hygiene in neurodivergent youth. And so, I have a few things that I think we will be looking at. And so, we'll take a peek at the agenda here. Let's see if it's gonna, there we go. So for our agenda, we want to explore reframing self-care challenges. We're going to talk a little bit about understanding the neurological and developmental factors that can be associated within this age range. We're also going to talk about those barriers in some more detail. So some of the barriers being executive functioning, sensory processing, and interoception. We'll talk about motivation, time perception, and transitions. And in addition to that, we will even go over some practical strategies for home and other kind of avenues of engagement, be it school or extracurriculars. We'll talk about supporting autonomy, dignity, and independence as well. And then we'll make sure that we have some time left over for questions and reflection. I usually like to be fairly interactive in these presentations, and so I really do encourage discussion and questions kind of as we're going through the content. So feel free to post your question in the chat. Let me see if I can have that running. Um, so as I was saying, yeah, let's try to keep things interactive. I do have the chat open here on the side, so I can for the most part follow along. And any kind of anecdotes or things you'd like to share are always welcome. The more we connect the material away from sort of that textbook feel and more into kind of real life scenarios and examples, the more that it resonates and stays with us. So there we go. Okay, so the first thing we do is let's reframe self-care in the first place. Okay. But we're going to go into reframing self-care. So quite often, self-care can be assumed to be a sense of laziness or defiance. And we want to think about what laziness and defiance actually are before we are attaching those labels to aspects of either incomplete self-care or self-care tasks that haven't even been started, let alone not necessarily finished. There's always there can be, I don't say always, but there often can be a neurological or sensory component to the task. And that neurological and sensory component for some can actually feel quite complex. And so we want to try and break that down a little bit further today as well. We want to think about shifting from compliance into more so capacity building. So the intention for today is to try to understand and reframe what it can feel like when we are struggling to engage in that self-care. And instead of helping increase, trying to actually build capacity. And so what that means is when we're building, I'm just trying to adjust, there we go. So when we're trying to build capacity, that doesn't mean that we're looking for a kiddo to be listening to us, right? Or not listening to us. It's more so what is their capacity level at this time, and how can we gradually increase that capacity? As opposed to just a black and white listening or not listening. All right. And then, of course, one of our bigger goals there is we want to create that independence, but we want to do so with a sense of dignity, not so much fear-based or obligation-based, but more so with that sense of mastery and sense of independence, that this is kind of the level that they can handle independently, and this is the level that we're supporting them to get to, and then eventually they can get there themselves. And so then we can start to kind of move up the ladder that way. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to enforce and explore some of these pieces today. Does that sound okay for everybody so far? I'm hoping that is kind of in line with what you were hoping to encounter today. If there's something that you're also hoping for us to discuss, but I didn't necessarily mention it, then please feel free to put it into the chat as well. I see lots of thumbs up, so that's great. So let's talk about some common concerns here. We can encounter avoidance of hygiene routines. We can encounter emotional escalation or just flat out refusal. Just maybe starting the task, there might be some conflict in even getting to the place where we're starting the task, and then we start the task, but we just boom, stop right there in the middle of it. Sometimes, as a parent or someone that is supporting the individual, getting them to the place where they can just start the task. Let's say the example here is brushing our teeth. So, getting them to the place where we are now actively brushing our teeth can feel like an uphill battle. And so, once we've got to what we assume is the top of that hill, and then we encounter this refusal or disengagement, that can be incredibly frustrating and exhausting for the individual that is supporting, what be the parent or whatever, because you feel like you've already climbed your hill, right? But that's one of those pieces that we're reframing, is that the hill is not so much getting them to, agree to the task, but it's more so actually, completing the actual task in itself, right? And there's a reason that we often encounter so much of that, immediate shutdown once we're in the task. And then, of course, inconsistent follow through. So, we got to do this the other day or the last week or so, and then we fall off the wagon. But that's another thing that we want to reframe, is that we're not necessarily falling off the wagon. It's just that the strategies that we were using maybe were no longer as novel, or were no longer as supportive anymore. So we'll explore that conversation as we continue forward. And then, of course, we're going to be encountering that parent-child conflict, or sibling to sibling conflict, or caregiver to minor conflict, whatever the relationship dynamic might be. But the conflict further creates kind of that avoidance of the task as well. So that's another thing that we want to explore a little bit further. Some of the things that I have mentioned or kind of noted down for myself as examples of challenges with self-care, I'd be happy to put out there, but I'd like to hear what you think first. So you can pop it into the chat, or just take yourself off mute and shout it out. What are some things that you encounter as a hygiene routine or a self-care activity or task that can be challenging or difficult for you? Anybody want to share? Shout something out. Motivation is low. Yes, absolutely. There should be a little microphone at the top to help you unmute. No buy-in. It's not something that's important to them. Absolutely. It doesn't hold the same weight or the same value, of course. Zoning out. Yep. Yep. And then it's difficult to kind of get back on task, but we are also trying to monitor that privacy and that respect piece, of course. Yep. Teeth brushing. Yes. I also have, so like, hair brushing. Oh goodness, that's a really big one for my kiddo as well. Yep. Hair brushing. Let's see. They'll do it later. Yep, yep. Nail cutting for sure. They do require that support. Yeah, a lot. Sometimes there's a lot of hand holding that is involved there, right? Um, so I have things like, already mentioned here, avoidance of showering, or not really being as structured in the shower in terms of, you know, completing all our shower tasks, whether it be shampooing or conditioning or body wash or whatever else it might be, right? I'll do it later is a frequent one that we're seeing here. Yeah, and then also, even if we are using those products, are we using it properly on all the parts that need to be cleaned, right? And so, and are they cleaned properly? So yes, that's another big piece as well. Some of the ones I had is toothbrushing. So that's a big one. Deodorant, use of deodorant. Um, Clothing, so just making sure our clothes are clean. Shampooing hair, I see. Yep. Um, various types of body care struggles, if we need to kind of shave or groom kind of facial hair, those pieces. There's a lot of emotional pushback, shutdowns, refusal, repetitive reminders, a lot of prompting required, direct instruction. Absolutely. So that's great. We're seeing a lot of things. Food, yeah, food on face for sure. Absolutely. Um, just kind of that clean clothes thing, I think, is another big one, especially with like underwear and socks and bras and things like that, as well, as another big piece too, right? So because it's easy enough to get away with that, if no one's really monitoring. Your shirts can catch more attention, but yeah. So let's think about what's really happening there. Okay, and so what what is causing some of the avoidance, pushback, or shutdown of the tasks that we've been talking about here? And so the ones that I've listed here is we have executive functioning demands, sensory processing differences, interoception challenges, emotional and developmental factors, and transition difficulty. But let's talk about those in more detail. So with the executive functioning demands, I'm going to ask if someone can give me a task that might have, a hygiene task or a self-care task that has a few steps involved. Can anyone put one into the chat box that we can use as an example? Brushing teeth. Okay. Brushing teeth and showering. Let's start with brushing teeth. Okay, we see oral hygiene again. So number one, um, you're going to have to leave the space that you're in. Okay, after that, you're going to have to now relocate to a space that you didn't want to relocate to. Those are two different things. And when you go to this new space, the environment in the new space is going to smell different. It's going to have different lighting. It might have a temperature change, assuming on where you were in the first place. Okay. In addition to that, you are now going to have to, let's say, start by turning on the water. So you got to turn on the water. You got to make sure the temperature of the water feels good. Then you got to get your toothbrush. You have to clean the toothbrush. After you clean the toothbrush, you have to get your toothpaste. No, sorry, you have to shut the water off because we don't want to waste water. Shut the water off. Get your toothpaste. Put the right amount of toothpaste onto the toothbrush. Close the toothpaste. Put the toothpaste away. Pick where you're going to begin brushing your teeth. Put the actual toothbrush into your mouth and then start to brush those teeth. Experience the taste of the toothpaste, the smell of the toothpaste, the feel of the bristles. Rosemary, I hope you're catching all of this. And on top of that, you're also going to now start to feel bored because this is also really boring, right? It's been going on for a long time. And kind of forced yourself through that. Then you're going to take the toothbrush out of your mouth, but you've got toothpaste on your fingers that's mixed in with saliva, spit. So that's gross. You don't like that. And you can smell the toothpaste and it's all around your lips and it's on your toothbrush and you have to figure out what you're going to clean first, which that's really difficult to figure out. And so you're going to have to open the water and you're going to have to start by washing your hands and then you're going to have to wash the toothbrush and then you're going to have to wash your mouth and then you're going to have to rinse and now you have a burning feeling because the toothpaste has been in there for a while. So the burning feeling, you can experience it in your nasal cavity and you can experience it in your eyes. Those are two separate things. And now you're going to have to turn the water off and you're going to have to put the toothbrush away and you're going to have to find a towel to wipe, your hands and the sink and your mouth. And your shirt because there's water there now too. Okay. And so let's just stop that there. Were we able to count? We got about 41. So Erin says 41. Rosemary says at least 20 at minimum. Yeah. So every single one of those is a separate experience. Leaving the space, that in itself probably has 10 little tasks attached to it, but I didn't mention all of them. I did mention the sensory ones. So we can think about a task that's as simple as getting up to go brush your teeth. It's not actually that simple. It requires a significant amount of output of awareness and energy because all of the things that I've mentioned there have sensory input. The feel of the cap, the ridges on it, that has sensory input. Opening it, the pressure to do that has sensory input, right? And so when we are receiving that sensory input, we are having to attend to it. And so that is all executive functioning because we have to not attend to what we want to attend to, but rather attend to the feel of the cap, right? That we have to now use pressure or apply pressure to unscrew. And also we don't want to lose that cap. It's going to roll away. So when I talk about brushing our teeth to that extent, does anybody have any thoughts? Does it sound like a task you want to do with the 41 steps roughly that we just mentioned? Exhausting. It's exhausting. I would rather not do that. Overwhelming. Absolutely. Overstimulating, I bet. No, we don't want to do it, right? And so when we're trying to think of some of these self-care tasks, always a fight. Yeah, because I would put up a fight to have to do those 41 steps for sure. And it is hard for a developing brain to have to filter, um, what is or is not important to pay attention to. Absolutely. Yeah. And having to let go of what we are doing. So when we think about it like that, the executive functioning demands and the sensory pieces just alone already are creating a simple task to be far more extensive than it is, right? Um, So when we do something we enjoy, that's a dopamine driven system. We receive that kind of reward, that hit in our brain for doing something that we want to do. And in a neurotypical brain, you have a little bit of dopamine that still gets released around the sense of completion or just compliance. But in a neurodivergent brain, we don't have the same things acting as reward triggers for dopamine. So you're actually being forced to do something when your brain chemistry is not releasing any of the neurochemicals that you need to actually do that task, let alone the fact that it's also going to be 41 steps. So there's more than one system at play, right? When we say lack of motivation, when we say pushback, that's kind of where a little bit of that is coming from. Um, so that's that executive functioning load, right? Lack of dopamine and that time distortion, doing something you know, uh, for even 30 seconds can feel more like 30 minutes, right? And so we don't have that accurate sense of time without some sort of external cueing for that, right? And if we have someone that's watching us and cueing us, that is where that sense of defiance or non-compliance can sometimes manifest from, is that it's just we just don't want to be watched through those 41 steps that we don't have the dopamine to do right now that feel like 35 minutes, right? Any thoughts on that so far? Especially if they, yeah, that's the last comment we had. Any thoughts on that so far? No? Okay. So let's continue. Yeah, what that well, thank you. I don't know if some of you are already aware of this, and I think when we sit down and we talk about it, we're like, yeah, that's pretty obvious. Like all of those pieces for sure are overstimulating, and those are all those sensory things. But in that moment, we don't think about it because we are working with brains that have fully developed prefrontal cortexes, right? That's this section over here. That is our, executive functioning section. And even if we ourselves may have ADHD or maybe on the spectrum or something like that, we still have all those years of experience. We still have that ability and that resiliency to power through unpleasant experiences. This is called distress tolerance. We have developed a sense of or an ability of tolerance towards distressing things, right? But at 10 to 14, you don't have that yet. And so another thing that I'd like to talk about around what's happening beneath the surface here is more so around emotional and developmental factors. Okay. And yes, we do, we need dopamine for everything. And so that, we have to do. And so often a statement in our house to externalize that is not so much that I don't want to do this, I don't feel like doing this, I can't do this. It's more like I don't have the dopamine for that right now, right? And so that externalizes it. I'm no longer the individual that is non-compliant, disobedient, struggling. It's not my fault. It's that I just don't have the dopamine for that. That's a brain thing, right? It's a neurochemical thing. And so psychoeducation around, how the neurodivergent brain works, even for little kids, is still quite helpful. But 10 to 14, we're old enough and, we're mature enough to be able to have some of these conversations around the psychoeducation of what's happening in your brain, because then they can use that language to empower themselves, right? Um, but we'll circle back to that, as we continue in the presentation. I'd like to talk a little bit about the developmental factor right now. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the hand model of the brain. If you are, you can put your thumbs up, but I'm going to work through it with us right now anyway. So this is the way that it works. If you have your hand, you're going to take your thumb, some of us are familiar, and you're going to fold your fingers on top. And so this would be my brain, okay? So these are my two eyes, and then this would be the two eyes over here. So up here is kind of that forehead space, okay? And then down here is kind of like the base of your neck, all right? And so and then this middle section, that's kind of where my thumb is tucked in. That's like if you stick your fingers between your ear, don't do this at home, right? But if you actually went through all the way and whoopsies, and then you kind of went like that, that would be this section over here, right in the middle, okay? And so the way that the brain develops is it starts in sections. It starts over here, then it moves here, and then it moves here. And in human beings, humans are, I think, the only, if not one of the only mammals that actually have their young, their babies that are born without the full brain being developed. Okay, so the structures are in place, but the neural circuitry and the wiring is not fully in place. And so you can almost imagine like a shelving unit. So the shelves are installed, right? Shelf one, shelf two, shelf three, very simplified version. The shelving units are there, but we haven't actually put in any of the dishes or glasses or mugs or whatever you want to call it. Okay, so they're not empty, but they're pretty bare. And so as they continue to grow, that's when these shelving units actually start to fill up with the things that they're meant to hold. And it goes in sections. So this first section we call our lizard brain, okay? And it's a lizard brain because it's mainly just survival. This is your balance, this is chewing and swallowing and breathing and heart rate and all of those, walking and those pieces. And these are the things that we see babies basically doing and toddlers doing, right? Um, and so when an area of the brain is under active, growth, what's happening is that the body is concentrating oxygenation and blood flow, and this is increasing the neural circuitry. And whatever this section is responsible for, those behaviors, those actions are basically on fire. So when you think about a baby, they're doing a lot of like putting things in their mouth and discovering that their hand is controlled by them. And there's a lot of cause and effect type of the toddlers that throw things. And I could do that. I have the power to do that. So that cause and effect experimentation, right? That learning to balance and that learning to kind of chew and how to swallow. If you've ever seen, if you've had well, you've had babies, right? But if you've seen them and they do this thing that horrifies all new parents where they just kind of go right when they're still learning to swallow. So this is kind of what's happening in that lizard brain. Okay, they're not able to regulate their temperature or their breathing yet. That's why we're monitoring them in that first year when they're sleeping, all those pieces. But then that's done. And so then what the brain does is it trims any extra neural circuitry that it doesn't need there. And then you hit your adolescent years, around 11, 12-ish, like tween actually, and you move into this section over here. Okay. This is your monkey brain. And it's deep inside, and we call it the monkey brain because this is kind of the next evolutionary stage, I guess you could say. Again, very simplified. And this is your limbic system. So this is where all of those fight, flight, freeze responses come from, right? Threat responses, risk-taking behaviors, emotional turbulence, all of that comes from over here. And our adolescents are in the thick of it. So this part of the brain from about, let's say, 12, does anybody know how long this goes for? Anyone take a guess how long this goes for before yep, that's right. So till about 22 to 25 years old. So so you guys already know this. So again, you're going to be in here and you're going to have a lot of oxygenation and blood flow, and the neural circuitry is actually going to be increasing. Your brain is going to be linking and creating far more neural circuits than it needs in this moment. And it'll go back and trim them like around 24, 25 years old. Not yet. But a lot of the challenges that we've talked about are going to feel more harder than they are because we're in this stage, because this part of our brain is on fire right now, and we haven't fully grown the executive functioning piece that can learn to override that unpleasant experience. And so that unpleasant experience on a scale of 10, 10 being miserable, one being totally fine, as an adult with some good distress tolerance skills, that can be, like a 3 out of 10, or maybe, a max of a 4 out of 10. But when we're looking at, an adolescent, let's just say neurotypical, um, you want me to use the actual names and parts of the brain? Um, so the hand thing is just to kind of follow the sections. But what's happening in here, as I said, is this is the limbic system, and it's your amygdala that's actually creating that sense of fight, flight, or freeze. But if you'd like to share, kind of some of the language that you use, that would be wonderful. I'd be happy to have you share that as well. Just those, nothing else? Okay. So, let me know. I'll start using some more terms, and then if you need me to explain them or you know them, that's perfect. So, as I said, limbic system, right? Which often can be referred to as your monkey brain. So your amygdala is fight, flight, freeze, but there's a few other pieces in there as well, right? So another one is your hippocampus, which is responsible for that memory, and it's also tied to your emotion. And so what's happening in here is we have to brush our teeth, and on a scale of 1 to 10, as an adult, that could be a 3 or a 4 out of 10. It's not the worst thing, right? It's manageable. Maybe it's even pleasurable. So if I use this friendly little scale that I have here, which is fairly simplified scale, as an adult, we might be kind of landing over here, right? I'm trying to like navigate this backwards, right? So maybe it's something we don't really want to do, but we'll do it. Or maybe we actually enjoy brushing our teeth. It's peaceful. We like our toothpaste, whatever. But for a kiddo that's neurotypical, okay, it might be something boring that we don't really want to do. So, we might push back. We might be kind of over here. We're looking at like a 6. We're not going to have that same executive functioning challenge. We're not going to have those sensory challenges, but it's not something we want to do, right? Um, when we're looking at our neurodivergent youth, um, those additional pieces are going to kind of land you up here, right? And so this is where some of us encounter those challenges, and we might be thinking, brushing teeth should not be landing up here on the scale, right? Like brushing teeth is down here. It shouldn't, this is not an accurate representation of the difficulty level of brushing teeth, but it is. And when we think about that limbic system, that's why, because the neural circuitry is on fire. You have far more connections back and forth even between, the experience of the smell and how unpleasant that was the last time around. So our sense of smell, which is our olfactory bulb, actually links directly to our emotional limbic system, right? And that's why smells hold such deep emotional connections. And our hippocampus in our brain is what brings those memories about. And because this part of the brain is on fire, you're going to have far more stronger associations, likely unpleasant associations as well. Okay. Um, that being said, we also have fewer dopamine receptors. And so, we're not going to have that same reward system activated. Now, eventually, as we grow older, we move on to the last part of the brain, which is up here. This is your prefrontal cortex, your executive functioning. This is our ability to override and talk ourselves through and find ways to, get ourselves through that task. But between the ages of 10 to 14, we don't have this fully developed yet. And this is actually in excess. And so, as the caregivers and as those providers of support, whatever your role is, you're almost going to be substituting this section. Okay. And so, when we talk about that hand holding and, this shouldn't be so far up the scale, this is more so disobedience or non-compliance, we want to kind of reframe that to this is my job right now, because this is neurology that they do not control, right? They don't control this. And so this is my job right now. I am here to act as their prefrontal cortex to support. You don't have to, but that's what we offer as a way of looking at it. Now, this is a fine balance because you also don't want to take over being the prefrontal cortex, but at the same time, there's a way to balance your level of engagement, which can be different from day to day as well. Okay. And then that speaks to that transition difficulty. Any questions around this before I move on? Shall I move on? Anything in there that you wanted me to um, revisit any specific terms or anything like that? Okay. So far, the key message here is we're trying to reduce that conflict, right? We're trying to build the skills and not so much the compliance. And we're going to try to protect that dignity and that autonomy whenever we can, while still trying to think about ourselves in this role versus more of the I'm going to kind of police what's happening next. Not that we're doing that, but sometimes we just need to get a move on and there's nothing else that we can do at this point, right? Um, so let's talk, and I think we already talked about this already, but let's think about executive functioning again. So within executive functioning, task initiation is particularly difficult, which is starting that task, right? But we can also have task stamina, which is sticking to the task, not getting distracted and doing something different. And then we can also have task completion, which is like actually getting to the end of the task with all the steps completed in the middle of it. Um, we talked about why task initiation is so difficult. We need to have that reward system activated. We need to have that dopamine flowing, right? And the task in itself has 41 steps, roughly. But stamina often gets overlooked. So stamina is why do we not stick to the task? Sometimes that can be because there's something more entertaining that we can't filter out of our brain, so we attend to that. But sometimes what we think is unrelated is actually related to the big picture of how we envision that task. So, and I'm going to just make this up, okay? But and often I'll kind of reference my own kiddos who are neurodivergent as well. So some of these examples might come from them. But if I were to ask my daughter to brush her teeth, the production that would be required there is that she has to set it all up. It's an experience, and it's not a fun experience, but it is something that requires setup. And so she's got to get her stool so she's tall enough as per the height that she prefers. To the mirror of the sink because she doesn't want herself to be at all just blocked by the faucet. So she has to make herself the right height. She has to have a towel, right, that's available there because she doesn't like her hands to be wet or whatever. And so there's many steps in there. And because then we have some of these executive functioning deficits, we're not going to be able to sequence those correctly before starting the task. And so sometimes we're going to get distracted. We're going to leave the task to do something that might seem unrelated, but it is still related to the task, right? An example of that might be something like, well, I got to leave and make sure that I go have my stuffy, who she calls Coco, ready in bed. I got to make sure that Coco is there. And that might come later on halfway through. And it's because Coco serves as a support, right? It's warm, it's cozy, it's nice. And we want to make sure that it's available once we finish this unpleasant task, but we forgot to set it up beforehand. Or it might be that, you know, today, for whatever reason, I had a fruit like pineapple that made my tongue a little bit more spiky or sore or tingly or whatever it might be. And so I'm just moving at a slower pace. And now I'm really curious about, if I can actually feel the spikes that I can feel on my tongue. Can I feel them on the tip of my finger? Right. And so, based on the age that they might be, some of these natural questions are going to interfere. And it isn't always distraction. That's a very logical question, right? Is there a cut on my tongue? Like, I need to go check that out. And so, you see them staring at their tongue. It doesn't necessarily always mean that we're distracted. Now, sometimes we are, but there's a deeper process and, additional things that are running in the background there that we can't always rule out or assume that we know. So that's kind of that sequencing piece that comes in, right? And then the time awareness absolutely is a big one. So monitoring time. So let's talk about sensory. Um, so we already talked about this in my example of brushing teeth, right? So there's water, there's the temperature of the water, there's the pressure of the water, there's the sound of the water, there's the smell of the water, there's the smell of the water in the sink and the water from the toilet, because the water from the toilet smells different than the water from the sink, right? And so sometimes it's just as simple as thinking about or discussing together, like, where are the sensory pieces, right? And so what something that you could do is you can take like a little sticky notepad, or like one of those things where it's like this, right? And so you kind of rip them off and they have like little tags or whatever, and you can go for a tour of the bathroom or whatever, and put a little tag on all the things that don't feel very pleasant. So you might put a little tag on the toilet bowl because we don't like the smell of the water, and we might put one on the shower curtain because we don't like the color of it, and we might put one on the faucet, and we might put one on the towel because it's fuzzy, or whatever else it might be, right? We might put one on the stool because the stool gets cold and we don't want to step on a cold stool. So put a little tag on all those things. And then we can talk about what that tag represents, right? So what does that tag imply? So for example, if we put a tag on the stool, afterwards we can say, well, tell me about this tag. Like, what can you tell me about it, right? Um, we're not going to lead the question and say, what don't you like? How can we fix it? Just, what can you tell me about it, right? What does this tag suggest about this stool or whatever it might be? And then that way you can problem solve. So if the stool is cold, and if the smell of the toilet water is gross, and if the towel is fuzzy, or all these other things, there are solutions for all of this, right? These are easy solutions. Close the bowl, um, brush, in a different part of the house if it's possible, right? Or in a bathroom that's structured a little bit differently. I'm just assuming that you have that option. Um, or, what can we do about the stool being cold? Maybe we could put a warm towel on there for a minute before you step on. And so some of this almost seems like we're making things easier, but we are making things easier. That's the point. We are making things easier. And when we make things easier, what we teach and what we model is problem solving skills. Because when, this 14-year-old is 24 or 34, they're going to have that built-in ability to identify what the issue is, then think about why it's an issue, and then come up with a solution for that issue, right? But we're teaching that right now. So a little heater in my washroom has been a game changer. Yeah, absolutely. Um, the cold alone is something that would throw off any kind of shower, like just the pushback for a bath or a shower, just because of the experience of the 10 seconds getting out of the bath or the shower and then wrapping up in a towel. Like, just, it's just brutal, that experience of cold, right? So those little tags can be a great way to help problem solving, because then you have like little visual things that you can rip off, or whatever you need to do once you've solved that problem, right? Um, some of the other things I have is like the smells, right, of the products, the sounds of a fan, or if there's an echo in a bathroom because it's a smaller space. This experience of having wet hair can be really uncomfortable. So how can we problem solve these things? That's usually what we're looking at, and we're looking at creative problem solving. So the balance of problem solving with resiliency. Um, so yeah, so sometimes we find that kiddos will stay on the path of least resistance, um, in the sense that they are not learning those distress tolerance skills, I think is what you're suggesting, right? And so we want to think about distress tolerance skills as a continuum, or like a ladder. Okay, so if we think about the experience of, let's say, the water pressure in a shower, okay, even if it's on the lightest setting, um, if we immediately say that, this is something that we want to practice through, and so we're going to go like 1 minute in the shower, 2 minutes in the shower, all the way up to 10 minutes, that isn't actually titrating um, the the actual pressure. What it's titrating is the time. But when we're problem solving, we want to be mindful of what are we actually problem solving? Is it the time or is it the pressure? Because even 1 minute of water pressure is still 1 minute of water pressure. And we might have time blindness. So that 1 minute makes no difference to 5 minutes. And so what we actually want to titrate is more so the pressure. And so how can we titrate the pressure? So let's problem solve that. If we're in the tub, can we begin by using a water cup? Right? Because now we control the pressure that way. So this is, again, just creative problem solving. So if I'm going to take away the water pressure, how can I create a ladder of exposure to water pressure at the lowest tolerable level and then build steps up from that? So if the lowest tolerable level is using a water cup that I pre-fill myself, and then I can use that, then that would be a place to start. But then we don't want to get stuck there, right? Because that's where we come back to that comment of then we're always just going to pick the path of least resistance. So eventually we want to take that initiative and that joint mutual decision to take one step forward. And sometimes making them the leader in what that one step forward would be or look like, that can help because then they're now kind of managing that ladder with you, right? So there's some ownership and there's some engagement in this, and that increases novelty and dopamine because now we're part of this project and this experiment or whatever it might be. We can we need a shower or a bath, but we can skip washing hair. Yep, and sometimes that can be helpful. Yep, sometimes it can just be let's just wash our parts. We're going to use that water cup to wash our parts, and we're not necessarily going to need to do the full shebang, right? And so on those off nights versus the full nights, you can kind of change it that way. If you have a kiddo that's more heavily dependent on choices, then they can pick which night is an off night or not, assuming that that is possible, that they haven't been out in the dirt all day or whatever, right? Playing something or engaging in like a sport or whatever it might be. So if it's possible, you can kind of create that sense of ownership of like, okay, what kind of night is it going to be tonight? Off night, water cup night, or shower night, or bath night, or whatever it might be. And then that also creates dopamine. A big part of what we're doing is chasing dopamine. Quite often, we're chasing dopamine, and that gives us that ability to do those things that we otherwise don't want to do. And we're also teaching problem solving, right? So adding novelty is one way to problem solve. Um, Building a ladder is another way to problem solve. Okay. Another kind of challenge here is interoception. And so we don't always have that awareness of our body cue, right? In the sense that we might not be aware of the fact that we are sweaty or that we have a body odor or that our hair is greasy or that there's dirt in our fingernails. Or that it's been, certain number of hours and I need to be mindful of like menstrual hygiene, right? So these pieces we aren't always aware of them, and so therefore there's kind of this low motivation for it, and in those cases, can we set up some sort of external support system, in like, can we set timers or can we kind of have like checklists or things like that, but more so towards hygiene than task completion per se, right? Sometimes checklists and stickers and task completion organizers don't always work in neurodivergence because they're often designed to reward at the end of the task as opposed to at the beginning of the task. So you almost have to rearrange how you use the organizers. And I've seen my daughter do this. We'd have like a little homework schedule and she would give herself the check mark and the sticker before she did the math page. And I'd be like, that's not really fair. And she'd be like, oh, but I'm gonna do the page because I have a sticker. So like, it's a guarantee, right? But if we made her wait for the sticker afterwards, or the check mark, or whatever, checking it off, whatever it was, that is not going to work. So oftentimes we need to rearrange some of our motivational systems that we have in place, so that the reward or the dopamine hit comes at the beginning to an extent. To an extent, that can also be something that can be taken advantage of as well. That works more when we have kiddos that are a little bit more rigid in their thinking, and, have this kind of mechanical structured thinking that, like, this must then equate to that, versus our procrastinators. Um, Another piece that can kind of jump in here is, actually, I want to go back to intraception. There's this kind of shame sensitivity as well, right? And between the ages of 10 to 14, that is a heightened experience for many of us. Those are our puberty years. This is when our body is changing, routines are changing. Um, we're still trying to navigate what this means for us, and what our identity is, and how we fit into this new version of ourselves that's forming here. And so there's a major sense of loss of control. And there's quite a bit of free autonomy that is now lost, in the sense that if I don't put on deodorant now, it's going to be a full day thing, right? Um, no, it's no worries, not a problem. It's recorded anyways. Um, so intraception, so that's something that you're really struggling with. Why don't you tell me a little bit about it? So tell me what's going on with intraception, if you don't mind, in the sense that they're not picking up on their like, is it oily hair, body odor, clothes being dirty? Tell me, and we can see if we can come up with some solutions around that, right? Um, and while you're doing that, oh, can't smell anything. And that can also just be like a sensory thing. Like, his or her olfactory might just be um, different for certain smells. We have sensitivity towards certain smells, and then almost kind of the opposite, where we can't identify certain smells as well. And so doesn't like the feel of water for sure. Um, and so if we can't kind of figure out or identify our own body odor, then it has to end up being something that's a little bit more mechanical, because we're not going to be able to rely on that ourselves. So by making it mechanical, you're almost going to create some sort of, and I'm just spitting ideas, okay? So this might not work. I see a lot of things coming in here. So if we're going back to the deodorant, you might have kind of like a little set of boxes or whatever that is accessible wherever we're getting ready. And so you can go through box one, box two, box three. Sometimes there's a sensory thing in there that we do like. For example, the click of a box. So if you are clicking open a box and clicking closed a box, that might be something that you might like. So when we're problem solving this, we're trying to make it more mechanical instead of depending on that interoceptive awareness. But to teach the concept of body odor, are there certain smells or sounds or tastes that kiddo doesn't like? Because that's where that discussion comes in. And that's often what we do in counseling, is where we have that discussion around, well, what is the taste of, like, yams? Like, I hate the taste of baked yams personally. Like, if you compared that to body odor, for me, I would learn that lesson very quickly. Not that I'm being forced to eat the baked yam, but just to kind of create that experience that um that's how much of an aversion I have to that taste. That, similarly, even if yams were being cooked, I could smell them. And so we're trying to create that understanding of body odor in that sense, through a more realistic link than just, this is what exists. So there's kind of learning to develop that understanding through something we already have a strong emotional connection towards, but also just setting up that box system can be one way where it's less um, dependent on you having to make that choice. And it's not a choice, it's just a preset system for you, right? Um, the time blindness in showers is definitely a thing. So oftentimes with that time blindness, we want to have that clock. I don't know if you've ever seen those clocks that have like chunks that are colored in. And so, if you buy like a regular clock from the dollar store and you open the face, you can actually build in colors across the sections. And then that way you're in the shower for the length of the color or whatever it might be, right? Um, we already talked about. So time perception, I mean, this is pretty easy. We're using timers and we're using clocks that have colored sections in them oftentimes. Um, but we also want to develop some skills around that. And so these are self-monitoring skills that we're trying to develop as well so that we're not rushing around. And so that might be pre-planning or pre-arranging things, but it might also be making it into a game. So I'm going to have you just wing this and I'm going to time you. And then we're going, how do we get them to actually look at the visual timer? That's a great question because we made this beautiful clock, but it doesn't mean that they're going to use it. So I'll circle back to that in a moment. Um, we need to develop, I guess the answer is built in here. We need to develop a sense of buy-in, right? And how are we going to get that buy-in? Well, we need to have something that makes this interesting or engaging. How are we going to make this interesting or engaging? Having some sense of control or autonomy or leadership to the problem solving piece of it can often do that. So if I'm going to just let you wing this task, I'm going to time it, then we're going to see, how far along you got or whatever. And then next time around, we're going to see where we need to build in some prep. You get to decide that. Okay. So you get to have this feedback report of me timing, and then you're going to decide, what to change or how to edit it. But we're doing it almost in the sense of making it an experiment. It's not a lecture. It's not a, lesson. It's more so a game. It's more so an experiment. It's like, okay, trial and error. What if we change this? Or what if we change that? Or I'm going to give you 3 random items that are supposed to somehow help you here with this. And you get to use these 3 random items creatively to help you do this task faster, and we're going to time it, right? And so now they're engaged in the timer because now it's an experiment. Now it holds value for them to time the task, and that's assuming that they're going too slow. Maybe they're going too fast. Maybe they're just taking an 18-second timer, or sorry, 18-second shower that was mentioned earlier. Well, again, we still need to use our monitoring and our experimenting to see what can we do to now extend the task, right? So that you're in there or you're using the right amount of time. And so making it into a game, making it into some sort of not a competition, but more so something that needs to be outdone the next time around or monitored or tracked or whatever it might be can sometimes add some engagement in there, especially for this age group between the ages of 10 to 14. Like they're not like out there at 16, 17 yet. Between 10 and 12, there's a little bit of engagement here still with you if you're willing to kind of buy into the silliness of it, right? So if you were willing to have a plate of ice cubes and see how long it takes for them to melt um, in a hot shower, right? That would be like an experiment that's a little bit kind of out of the box, I'm assuming, I don't know, or anything else that's a little bit kind of risky or kind of just pushes those boundaries just a wee bit. If you're engaging in that with them, they're going to have more buy-in, or you are being an active audience to their ideas that you normally would be like, no, we're not going to do that. Like, I'm going to eat this orange in the tub. No, we're not going to do that. But maybe you will. Maybe that's okay, right? Problem solving is creativity and finding where the win is. We're almost trying to reframe this expectation of things being done in the right amount of time, in the right way, without any kind of extravagant motivating system. That's a pretty tall order. And especially for this age, why do we have this tall order? Right? And so I would invite us to think about that. Like, why? Why do we have this tall order on the table? Is it because they need to learn this? But we're teaching them problem solving. if they just follow the tall order, they're probably just masking at that point. And we don't want them to mask at home. That's the one place they shouldn't be masking, right? And so we'll almost have to take a step back and say, I gotta try and find a way to help myself feel okay with them doing something that is going to feel good for them at the same time as get the task done, right? As opposed to, I just want them to master this task because they're going to mask all day anyway, or they're going to be struggling through trying to mask all day anyway, or they're going to struggle with not meeting everyone else's expectations or their own expectations, or they are meeting the expectations, but they had to work 10 times harder to meet those expectations. And so when we're at home, we don't want to do that, I assume. We want them to be able to be free and be silly and enjoy and, you know, be their truest, most authentic self in which they are washing themselves with an ice cube. And it's not going to burn or harm their skin. So it's okay in that moment, if that makes sense. Yeah. And so some of that is, you know, us as the care providers knowing that they don't have this built. They're functioning from this part of the brain. And this part of the brain needs novelty. It needs dopamine. It needs excitement and safe risks. Safe risks is a big one. We are oftentimes chasing dopamine. We are oftentimes finding ways to create safe risks to help problem solve, um, doing these things that we otherwise cannot do independently because of how difficult they are. Um, but in being able to problem solve that, we are developing the distress tolerance skills to then be able to do it independently when we are an adult. Yes, does that make sense? Um, okay, let's keep moving along. I think some of this we talked about. So puberty increases those demands. And then we have that identity and autonomy that I was talking about in terms of masking and the expectations. And then being able to just kind of be our true authentic self. Our social awareness also increases eventually, but not always immediately. And sometimes in this state, we might have a heightened sense of social awareness, or we might not, or we might have awareness of some things, but not other things. And those some things might seem really irrelevant in that moment. But what we're trying to remind ourselves is that that growth progress, it's not linear, right? We kind of go back and forth in that developmental time frame that we're looking at between 10 to 14. And so where we are encountering gaps or deficits or, you know, a bit of a lag in kind of evening out, that's where we as the care provider are filling in with our prefrontal cortex to support. Okay. So I think we already talked about this. Hygiene is low reward for the most part. So we're trying to make it high reward. How can we make it high reward? This is not your job to figure out alone every single time. That is teaching learned helplessness. So finding a way to make hygiene high reward and engaging kiddo in that problem solving process, that is the opposite of learned helplessness. That is learning self-mastery and independence and autonomy, because they're going to probably need to find a way to make things high reward even into adulthood, but then they'll know how to do it. Obviously, preferred activities are high reward. So how can we link those two? How can we find a preferred activity that is going to pair with this otherwise low reward activity? And maybe it's a bit of a risk, but it's a safe risk, then it's okay. Stopping preferred tasks is very difficult. And that's something that we have to pre-plan for, right? And it's easier to stop a preferred task if the next task still has some element of preferred activity to it. And then the last one I have here is challenge is disengagement, right? So sometimes if we're challenging all of these other pieces, then what we encounter is a kiddo that is just completely disengaged. Why did that happen? There we go. Okay, so we definitely talked about shifting the approach, right? From non-compliance to skill building. And that's where first we're trying to find a way to get into the task and maintain our stamina through that task. And then the skill building is the distress tolerance as we reduce the preferred activity that we've paired together with it. Asking what part is hard, we talked about that. And scaffolding. Or the support that we provide to scaffold success, right? Um, so with scaffolding, what we mean here is that we are doing some of that hand holding, but we're also doing it from the context of modeling it, and then allowing them to take it over as that approach continues to progress, right? So each week we're finding, or every couple of weeks, maybe every 2 weeks, we're thinking of something new to do during the bath because bath time is so miserably boring. But it's like I say, we're trying to allow them to have an active role and participation in that so that they are also being able to kind of hold their own hand through that process. And that's the scaffolding piece. And then eventually fade those supports over time. But between the ages of 10 to 14, that is a request that is not age appropriate because they don't have this in place. Oh, every time I click that. Okay. So some of these are a little bit more familiar, right? That we kind of already know about using timers and structures and breaking things into steps, using music as cues as well, and reducing that uncertainty, sometimes just walking through the entire routine, and maybe even flagging some of the areas that we're going to not enjoy in one color and then flagging the areas that we are going to enjoy in another color. And it might be like, for example, the pink stickies are for the things that we like and the blue stickies are for the ones we don't. So we're going to put a blue sticky on the bath towel and we're going to put a pink sticky on the toothpaste we want to use tonight and a blue sticky on the underwear because we don't like the feel of underwear, but we're going to put a pink sticky on the gummy that we get to have before we go to bed or whatever it might be. And so then we go in knowing what we're going to encounter. And the next night, it might be different. Those stickies might rearrange themselves. So giving them an option to say, okay, you got 5 minutes from the beginning to the end of this song or this timer or whatever it might be. Go in and rearrange your stickies, which ones are going to feel good and which ones are not going to feel so good today. And that's okay. We're normalizing that. And so that's how we normalize it. Like, yes, with every task, there will be some aspects we don't enjoy. There will be some aspects we do. We know what they are. And we have a plan for the ones that maybe we don't enjoy. And that kind of develops that distress tolerance skill. Um, I just referenced using music as a timer. And so for those of us that are not using the clock or not using the visual timer, we can try to incorporate a different type of sensory experience as a timer, such as the beginning and end of a song, or like the one where you watch the sand fall through, whatever it might be, right? Or when you shake something up and then all of it settles, whatever it might be, the bubbles or the glitter, there's different ones out there and they all have like different times. So if you wanted to, you can definitely use like visual timers like that instead of an actual clock, to support their engagement. But then of course you also run the risk of, I'm just going to sit here and watch the bubbles fall down the whole thing, right? And then at the end of the day, we're like, well, did we get like 75% of our task complete here in that we have, encountered some level of success? Then that's us coming back to that seems somewhat age appropriate, and maybe I need to find a new timer because this is not working. Once we're in it, we're in it. But then next time around, we have to use something different. Um, I have a smart home making announcements. Yeah, I love that. And your smart home device can also, I don't know if I'm not tech savvy enough to do this, but even if it was linked to your phone or something, you can have different kiddos be in charge of their voice being the one that announces it, because that adds novelty. Or if I did that, my kids are going to fight. So I would have them do it together because that would be a no-go in our house. So I'm going to have both of them record, it's time to take a bath. It's time to take a bath. And I'd probably have that play through the house in their own voice because they would probably find that hilarious, right? So a lot of what I've talked about is really just instilling a sense of novelty and engagement. Yes, they're not motivated, but we're trying to find a way to increase that motivation for them. That's most of what we've been talking about here. It's creativity, and it's not all your job. Help them be a part of creating um, these little rewards that will be supportive of them in the task that they're struggling with. So warnings, obviously, and I think we all already do a lot of these more traditional systems, right? Acknowledging that difficulty, having those predictable routines, and returning to those preferred activities after the fact. Um, when we talked about warnings, I said we're finding novelty, so I said putting stickies in there. Acknowledging the difficulty is running through the routine regardless of whether there's stickies or not, but having a plan for it. Predicting what our support system is or our plan is to get through that difficult task or the difficult section of the task, because each task has multiple steps that are some easy, some hard, right? And pre-planning what we're going to return to once we're ready to return to it. So we're offering choices, we're adjusting the environment, we're using alternatives, we're learning to practice tolerance, but in graduated steps instead of all at once. And then we're using that ladder approach, right? That's that graduated distress tolerance skill. But again, that is almost like step two. First, we just need to, offer those choices, adjust the environment, use those alternatives. And then once we have that task initiation and task engagement built in, and we have now rewritten that emotional memory of how unpleasant that is, then we can begin to circle back to developing that distress tolerance. Okay. Um, we've we've pretty much talked about all of this. And that independence is also gradual. But in the meantime, having them collaborate with us is a great way to create that sense of ownership and autonomy in the process. And at the same time, teach those independent skills. What we're trying to avoid is we're avoiding shame, but we are inviting that reflection. And sometimes it might not make sense to us why opening a toothpaste cap is unpleasant because they might not have the language to explain that the ridges don't feel good on my fingertips. But we want to try to allow ourselves to be present through that because what we do when we invite that reflection and we honor that reflection is that we teach them that they are not masking, that they don't need to mask. And that is a really important piece of home. Okay. Um, so connecting to our identity is again allowing them to have kind of the ability to choose their own silly things that they maybe want to build in there, and building that intrinsic motivation is so much of the novelty that we've been talking about in some of these problem solving approaches. When we're communicating, obviously we're using our neutral tone. We want to provide that feedback in private. So if you need to tell your kiddo, hey, body odor is evident and whatever, want to think about the words that they're going to understand, so that it's not too discreet, but at the same time, not too blunt. Sometimes we need to be blunt, but whatever it is, we want to do that in private, and we want to frame it from, building skills instead of policing or treating like a baby or things like that. Absolutely avoiding criticism because that's where our shutdown comes in, especially when we're in that stage where we're super sensitive or hypersensitive to that already, with that part of our brain kind of being on fire. Okay. When you're seeking support is when we have an escalating avoidance, right? To the extent that there's nothing you can do to support and it is interfering with their health and wellness, or the distress is significant enough that it's causing harm to self, right? Um, if there's a regression in any of our skills. And we can also look into a lot of different OT strategies that are quite helpful through some of these things as well. So like even like a weighted thing, you can still have like a waterproof weighted stuffy, like a plastic stuffy. I actually have one it's made of a material that is waterproof, but it's filled with something heavy. I don't know what it's filled with. And that could go in the tub, right? Or that can go with me and I'm not worried about it getting dirty or things. So there's other strategies that can be adjusted to accompany you in the task. Okay. Um, a lot of what I talked about, the distress tolerance building skills, creating those graduated ladders, figuring out what is or is not age appropriate, having those discussions to build interoceptive awareness, some of those things come from mental health support in the counseling context. So that's also something that you could choose to rely on, because you can't have all those conversations yourself. You can't manage all of that yourself. It's a lot. And so relying on those supports around you can help with that piece as well. Um, okay, at the end of it all, we're exploring progress over perfection. We're not trying to get to the most perfect step. So I'm going to reference being in the bathtub with the ice cubes again. That's still progress over perfection. We're going to celebrate those small steps, whatever they might be, right? And that is how we're building capacity. That is how we're having kiddos take ownership of self-care and bridge it to what serves their identity and who they are, in kind of a dignified way, as opposed to having this be more of a fear-based, police-based kind of system where we're reaching this goal that we think is the goal, but it isn't always the goal for everybody. Everybody's success is different, and it's different on any day, right? Some days success is something else, and some days success is something else. So we want to be mindful of what kind of day we're having as well. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for being so engaged. The chat was very interactive. I believe this has been recorded, so you can obviously circle back and find things in here or play around with some of the ideas.